Welcome to the final video of the series I published in the context of the release of my book titled Satoshi Nakamoto and the Origins of Bitcoin. So where are we and how have we gotten to this point? Well, we looked at different potential cues towards the identity of Satoshi Nakamoto, and for this we took a look at Bitcoin's technological background, potential traces in the Bitcoin white paper and codebase. Based on this information, we drafted a likely profile of Satoshi Nakamoto, investigated ecosystems and candidates, and this chapter is about what I refer to as the bigger picture. So to start this chapter, let's first take a step back and look how Bitcoin actually happened. So Satoshi Nakamoto only set the technological foundations. He engraved them more or less into stone, so they are valid in their basic principles forever. However, it was the community who brought life to Bitcoin in terms of improving its code base and most of all to adopt it in their user community. And nowadays there are many descendant blockchains that were optimized compared to Bitcoin in terms of performance or programmability, what is now called smart contracts. And it has reached way beyond its nerdy early adopter technology, because Bitcoin is less in its technology, but about what people make of it. And you can deeply analyze it, as it is done in my book, that the software and the message it sends appeals to very basic patterns that have been engraved by evolution into our psychology. It has certain traits of a belief system, so like religions, for example, and also certain aspects of pseudoscience. And so it has, probably not envisioned by Satoshi Nakamoto himself, like certain features of a cultural artifact. From my point of view, there's a strong historical dimension in Bitcoin. It has a deliberately anonymous inventor of a modern technology. He doesn't have any verifiable biographical details other than he must have been alive and at a certain age to be able to have had the educational background to creating Bitcoin in 2008 and leaving in 2010-2011. This is an unparalleled story of digital disguise. So actually previously, when we were in book printing and paper publications, this story would have been unconceivable because he would have had to go to a printing press and something. So the digital disguise was essentially a child of the 2010s. In addition, this individual with the pseudonym Satoshi Nakamoto covered, if you will, the entire pipeline from idea to technical implementation and the market. So essentially having people wanting to have it and being willing to pay a price for it. The first unicorn that is merely based on a combination of technology, trust, and emotions without an organizational structure in the classical sense, without a legal setup. And Bitcoin itself spawned blockchain technology and the correlated cryptocurrencies that are associated with these other blockchains. So it spurred essentially the development of a whole zoo of descendant technologies. And it's at the very core of decentralized finance, or DeFi, right, which still needs to be seen what can be done with it. It's pretty young still, and applications are out there, and maybe other applications are still to come in the future. Let's now view Bitcoin as a mere financial phenomenon. Bitcoin never received any initial boosting by, for example, founders and investors, and there was never any paid promotional campaign. Actually, Satoshi Nakamoto was very reluctant to accept overhyping of his cryptocurrency. The success of Bitcoin mainly roots in the removal of a central point of technical or legal attack, for example, a single server or a single legal entity that was in charge of the technology. Still, Bitcoin reached a market capitalization that ranks amongst major fiat currencies or global companies. So the market cap is of the order of about $100 billion at the time of recording this video. And this is despite of Bitcoin displaying deficiencies. So essentially, Bitcoin strongly deviated from Satoshi Nakamoto's intended application as an electronic cash system. So it lacks advanced privacy features, payments are traceable, and as an electronic cash system, the underlying currency, so Bitcoin, experiences too much volatility. He didn't program into the code anything that would mitigate large fluctuations of the value of the currency against fiat currencies. And very intriguing would be what would actually happen if we had a $1 million Bitcoin. So that would mean that Bitcoin would become a currency ranking amongst like the euro or US dollar or Japanese yen. And what would happen actually to central banks if that much money was poured into the Bitcoin blockchain? There's also some amazing correlations between the success story of Bitcoin and teachings we find in the fields of anthropology and psychology. So first of all, even though it's questionable whether that was actually meant to be implanted by Satoshi Nakamoto, there's actually very blurry information in the context of Bitcoin that leaves a lot of room for our human imagination. So Satoshi Nakamoto's sudden arrival spurs what might be referred to as an origin myth, and his departure in 2010-2011 evokes maybe something similar to an ascension narrative. Satoshi Nakamoto, of course, for the purpose of protecting his own privacy and essentially a central point of failure, but as a result of that, we don't have any accurate autobiographic information or contemporary records. That's one reason why we started this investigation. He also didn't leave a collection of teachings. So similar to a religious leader like Jesus Christ, I mean, he didn't write a book, even though Jesus Christ was able to read and write as far as we know, right? And Satoshi Nakamoto could have also left us with more clear instructions how to proceed in the future. The only thing we can do is extract and interpret that from his messages, but we don't have a systematic book which gives us very clear instructions. The human mind also seeks for explanations and solutions for the inexplicable and uncontrollable, like many archaic religions and so on are doing that. And in terms of Bitcoin, people looked at financial markets, central banks, and their monetary policies and were fearing that they're losing their financial assets. So they were worried about inflationary politics, the ongoing debt crisis, which is still ongoing, and the devaluation of their savings. So a question a lot of people had is how to protect and build up wealth in the time of financial crisis and uncertainty. So Bitcoin, in that very situation, offered an open canvas where people constructed simple answers and left room for projections of hopes and fears. And this is the very same foundation that many belief systems and pseudosciences are based on. Let's more concretely investigate the link between Bitcoin and so-called belief systems. So if you look into anthropology, as alluded to on the last slide, we have to look at basic evolutionary coined patterns of human psychology. So they serve in evolutionary purpose to improve, for example, the behavior of groups of human beings in prehistoric societies in particular. And our brain essentially is geared for asking questions like why, how, and who. That's, for example, a major driver why you might be following this very video. So this was essentially the basis for the founding of religions, which essentially occurred across all human societies. You hardly find any cultures that don't have any religious beliefs, and nowadays in particular also spurring populism. So people want simple answers to very complex scenarios. And in the Bitcoin field, some people say that Bitcoin has also developed a so-called Church of Satoshi, possibly because that's a consequence of how our brain functions to essentially react to the situation that we were exposed to several 10,000 years ago. So certain people, a significant fraction of Bitcoiners, are running what I would call a belief system in Satoshi and essentially the artifact of Bitcoin. So what are the features of Bitcoin as a belief system? Well, all the ingredients of belief systems are somewhat symbols. So in Bitcoin, we have the ticker symbol and maybe the number 21, which is kind of like preached essentially in many conventions and so on. We have rituals like these conventions or online fora where these things can be discussed in their own bubble of essentially believers. There's even a sacrifice involved, so you could consider, let's say, the 2000 mined bitcoins by Satoshi Nakamoto as lost or sacrificed by the founder of the technology. There are elements of fuzziness, so we, as mentioned, we don't have a biography of Satoshi Nakamoto, we don't have a book of teachings, so there's some room for everybody from different kind of walks of life and so on to find solutions, because if it had been too specifically defined, the room for speculation would significantly shrink. Bitcoin has certain narratives, so we all love this. If there are stories, if everybody has a certain hypothesis, how Satoshi Nakamoto created Bitcoin, what was his mindset and so on, and that's very appealing to our mind. And in particular, you find these patterns of creation out of nothing, or creatio ex nihilo, which is the term in mostly in religious sciences. And as mentioned, this ascension scenario, so the fading of the inventor. So when Bitcoin crossed the border between a nerdy cryptographer and cypherpunk technology to the public, we can also recognize elements that are supporting what is called pseudoscience. So examples of that, which are very famous, are the case of Nostradamus, who essentially made very famous prophecies, which are very fuzzy, and you can easily interpret like future happenings from a medieval perspective that still apply nowadays because simply they are not very concrete. There are these famous Illuminati, you have Freemasonry, which are based on conspiracy theories. So even though, for example, the Illuminati have been forbidden and there's no factual trace of them still existing, there are like very vivid kind of theories around them still circulating. Some people might even say Bitcoin had been invented by them, and it's very hard to disprove this, as this is more like rumor-based stories rather than facts. There was, in the height of the Egyptomania about 100 years ago, it was very popular to believe in the curse of the pharaohs, which was mainly driven by a press that needed stories rather than any scientific evidence. So a couple of people died who had entered these famous tombs of these ancient pharaohs, but it was quite clear that these were old or ailing people who didn't have a long life expectancies anymore after they stepped into the tomb, but that was completely overhyped by the press, who could sell then more newspapers. There's also the movement of anthroposophy, right, which is non-scientific reasoning of well-being in life and agriculture and a few other things, which also have certain traces similar to Satoshi Nakamoto. More recently, there was the hype around QAnon, which was also based on anonymously sent fuzzy messages. After having spent a lot of time and research on Satoshi Nakamoto and the origins of Bitcoin, I really arrived at the question, why am I and are we, as you proved by following this video, why are we so obsessed about formality, the formal identity of Satoshi Nakamoto, the name written in his passport? Isn't it much more interesting to find out about his mindset that led him to the creation of Bitcoin, to investigate Bitcoin's success model through this unique kind of combination of technology, trust, emotions, to ask Satoshi Nakamoto maybe just whether he was aware of the power of the origin myth he implanted into Bitcoin, or whether that was what I would find more likely, sheerly a measure to protect his own privacy and remove a central point of attack and failure in Bitcoin itself. Was Bitcoin actually a child of prolific internet? So was it necessary for Bitcoin to thrive through the 2010s, which was essentially in parallel to everyone having access to internet everywhere and any time? It would be interesting to discuss with people from other fields like history, like psychology and so on, about this element of Bitcoin that goes beyond the technology. Furthermore, we're talking about an inventor who is likely alive. He might even watch this video, hopefully having a laugh. And so that has never happened in the history of science and technology before. Usually we don't have access to the inventors because they mainly deceased, right? Here it's actually statistically very likely that the founder is still alive. So is he still interested in Bitcoin and blockchain? Is he involved? Did he completely abandon all this? What is he doing? That's a very intriguing question that we would only find out if Satoshi Nakamoto came back and gave us the pleasure of answering these questions, even anonymously. And in the bigger picture, was actually the invention of Bitcoin unavoidable? What is just a fortuitous, kind of like lucky, ingenious moment of its founder? Would kind of Bitcoin have happened at some stage anywhere because all the technological paths led to it? I would doubt it. I think it would have always. So if Satoshi Nakamoto hadn't been around, I doubt whether that would have been really happened, because maybe it would have happened too early or too late, where the public awareness wasn't there to kind of absorb it by a critical mass of developers and users. So there's an extended chapter investigating the bigger picture of Bitcoin. For the sake of brevity, we want to just use a couple of buzzwords here that might trigger your own thinking and imagination. So from my understanding, Bitcoin is certainly an ingenious invention. It's a groundbreaking, radically disruptive technology. It is undoubtedly a financial phenomenon. I would see it as a cultural artifact simply because it's something we discuss as mankind, whether in a positive or negative light. It has historical dimensions. Even Satoshi Nakamoto seemed to allude to certain contemporary events and maybe historical events, like the abandoning of the gold standard for the US dollar. It appeals to basic patterns of human psychology that evolved over evolution, for enabling essentially organizing a human population in the early days of prehistory. It has certain aspects of belief systems, so follows certain success models as well as pseudoscience. It contains elements of a self-fulfilling prophecy, which is even in the very own words of Satoshi Nakamoto. And it can be considered, from my point of view, as a mass behavioral incentivization scheme. So with all this, let's consider discussing Bitcoin as a cultural artifact. Bitcoin is certainly a game-changing socio-economic phenomenon. It also has the potential for advancing the organization of mankind. This is because it employs certain radically new principles like its chieflessness, so code is law, the community governance. It acts as a collective economic incentivization schemes of a completely new nature. It is permissionless and globally open and inclusive, so everyone literally can participate. It also polarizes human discourse, so you have strong promoters and believers and a significant opposition to it. It represents an historical item, but still of present-day use. So while its origins date back to the year 2008, that is not a long period in classical historical terms, but of course in the age of digitization, this is ages. So we're talking about something that we could rank as Stone Age. I would suggest to consider Bitcoin for the UNESCO Intangible Cultural Heritage. There are examples that would be comparable. Now something like songs of cultural significance or dances, and most interestingly, also the East German idea of practice of organizing shared interest in cooperatives had been adopted to this list some time ago. And even more, this would be the first item that will be borderless. So all these cultural heritage items are usually associated with one or a number of countries. Here we don't even have a country to name its origin. So it's a truly global ownership category, the first item on that particular list. So let's come up with a high-level summary of the video series. Now, Bitcoin essentially solved the problem of digital scarcity. And surprisingly, it did it by creating a trustless and chiefless construct that was unprecedented in the history. It is founded in cryptography. However, it wasn't cutting-edge cryptography even at the time in 2008. It resorted to digital timestamping that was known since the 1990s. The trust model is also very much based on open source, so everybody can see the Bitcoin source code. And peer-to-peer concepts were fundamental and stressed to a high degree by Satoshi Nakamoto. And the whole thing was later on characterized by Satoshi Nakamoto himself as a decentralized system. I find, in my honest opinion, that previous investigations were mostly name and punchline driven. They're very entertaining, but I find them critically flawed. And as a matter of fact, given the constellation with Satoshi Nakamoto only having left digital evidence and being very good at concealing his identity, finding the truth is necessarily very complex. So what we did here is we provided new evidence and combined it with existing evidence. We developed exclusion filters to essentially come down and show that there's not so many possible Satoshi Nakamoto candidates that would be around on this planet. We developed a putative profile, so kind of like a most likely character is drawn of Satoshi Nakamoto. So it includes his character and mindset, the background and kind of certain circumstances of his life, so in which time zone or continent he was living and so on. And definitely he must have had significant competences, and it doesn't sound like he could have pretended, for example, being a great C++ programmer and a lot of other software, hardware, networking competences where have to come together. We created a pool of candidates. For this, we looked at potential cryptography ecosystems, mainly in academia, which must have had, or at least some of them, must have had a very concrete link to Satoshi Nakamoto, so he somehow at least had very good friends and entertained like continuous communication with them, or he was even a student either at undergrad or postgrad level at these academic institutions. We screened a couple of research leaders and also cypherpunks, right, who were involved in similar projects. But it seems like the academics might have had some impact on Bitcoin, but it's unlikely that they were Satoshi Nakamoto, and the cypherpunks again didn't show certain features, for example, access to certain literature that they must have had if they had been the creator of Bitcoin and published the Bitcoin white paper and its references. We went through something you might refer to as celebs, so popular names that were kind of fielded in the context of the creation of Bitcoin, but also found like some very compelling evidence that they cannot be Satoshi Nakamoto. And eventually we drew the bigger picture, so essentially analyzing what, in addition to the technology of blockchain behind Bitcoin, what other things might fortuitously essentially have come together in order to enable the success story of Bitcoin. So after concluding my very intensive research on Satoshi Nakamoto and the origins of Bitcoin, let me share my hunch. Now, at first at Satoshi Nakamoto himself. I think his chief focus was on the technical implementation of Bitcoin and to protect his personal privacy, which was also very conducive to support Bitcoin's key concept of decentralization, the peer-to-peer mantra essentially. What was not on his immediate radar was probably the vital factors for the success of Bitcoin that were beyond the technical scale and that I pointed out in particular this video. So these constituents were the beneficial origin myth, his sudden departure, and these constituting the core plot of timeless narratives that have proven to be very successful in the history of mankind. I also don't think that several of the wider ranging correlations that were pointed out in this video were on Satoshi Nakamoto's map, so the cultural aspects, history, and certain features of human psychology. He also got lucky, or at least led by charismatic intuition, that these stories, so his technical basis in combination with these other factors, were appealing to evolutionary deeply ingrained archetypal psychological receptors, which were evoking strong emotions to motivate people, and these have proven to work throughout history of mankind and across all known cultures. He was also lucky, let's say Bitcoin, if it had been invented in the late 1990s, it probably wouldn't have thrived as much as it did nowadays. And that was that it was accompanied by the global financial crisis, which I believe Bitcoin and Satoshi Nakamoto couldn't have predicted in the year 2007 when he started the development of Bitcoin. Part of the breeding ground was also the quasi-parabolic proliferation of internet, which was then kind of available to anyone, anytime, anywhere, throughout mainly the 2010s. And in conjunction with that, the thorough permeation of our lives by social media in the 2010s, which kind of just created the echo chambers and bubbles that were vital for the creation of a community that was reaching essentially beyond expert cryptographers and anarchic cypherpunks. So essentially we had a global fan base of people who are willing to put down real money into a cryptocurrency. And this phenomenon of people investing, of course, first attracted more adventurous investors, and nowadays there's an increasing interest of institutional portfolio managers. One big question is, which is unanswered and impossible to answer, will Satoshi Nakamoto ever show up again, and what will be the consequences or the fallout? In the same way, I want to share with you my personal hunch at Bitcoin itself, why it's very special, and what are the key factors determining its future. Now, Bitcoin is the first asset class without a backing by a government like a fiat currency. It's not backed by any physical goods like precious metals, real estate or commodities. It's essentially just backed by the trust of its users. It doesn't have any intrinsically practical utility other than the payment itself. So you cannot give it as a gift to your parents as a jewelry or something like that. It doesn't have an intrinsic interest rate, like for example treasury bonds. It's not owned by an entity. It goes across all international borders. It doesn't have a traditional legal setup like an incorporation or anything. And it has a variable, essentially, or a fixed total supply other than fiat currencies, who usually tend to extend the total supply constantly and thus spur inflation. It's coupling to, let's say, its blockchain descendants, and in particular the DeSci ecosystem, is still to be investigated. Its dependency on fiscal policy, so we see a correlation between the value of Bitcoin and certain policies, interest rates and so on, that are imposed and announced by central banks and by the development of the Dow Jones Index, for example, and its coupling to macroeconomics. So what's very interesting is it doesn't seem to fit in any conventional economic models that are taught in colleges and treated by researchers. Now, throwing some interesting questions in here. Will there ever be a $1 million Bitcoin? It's certainly hoped by Bitcoiners. Will that ever happen? Will Bitcoin stay the dominant cryptocurrency? So currently it has roughly a market share of 1/2, a little bit less. Will it become a payment system, for example, through existing layer 2 solutions? Will it work at least as a long-term inflation hedge? That hasn't really manifested by now. Will there be stiff competition by all the planned central bank digital currencies? What about regulatory threats? Will Bitcoin kind of be untouchable while other cryptocurrencies will be suffering from regulation? How will Bitcoin perform against tech stocks or the Dow Jones Index and blue chips? And will it become the legal tender in more countries other than El Salvador? So let's revisit the book. So the book has about 200 pages of main text, which goes into very much detail for clarifying the evidence presented here. The table of contents structures in an introduction, the creation of Bitcoin, the Bitcoin white paper, the white paper references, the Bitcoin blockchain, the Bitcoin dates, the person and personality that comes across through Satoshi Nakamoto's messages. It speculates on the meaning and the potential meaning of digits and numeral systems that were chosen by Satoshi Nakamoto, then sorts like all this circumstantial evidence, so to see where it compounds to something more tangible. In the later parts, then a likely profile is developed, and then different Bitcoin environments or hatcheries are examined and identified in order to kind of have potential places where Satoshi Nakamoto might have resided or at least had strong connections to at the time when he built Bitcoin. Then in these environments, several exemplary candidates are found before we take like a bigger picture view and consider Bitcoin as a cultural artifact and its potential perspectives, and finally we draw conclusions. As a final note to my comprehensive investigation, I hope to have shed new light on the mindset and role of Satoshi Nakamoto, the origins of Bitcoin, its technological and psychological success factors, as well as its intricate coupling with happenings at the time. On your quest to Satoshi Nakamoto's identity, I have outlined why it is impossible to reveal his formal identity just based on indirect evidence without direct, ideally cryptographic proof, and even such method could be challenged. However, I have compiled ecosystems and candidates who might have, whether proactively or unknowingly, played a decisive role in the creation of Bitcoin, and listed strong exclusion factors, so you can certainly dismiss all nominations hyped in the public so far.